Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Hong Shui Wei, for that very kind introduction, those remarkable words that were your own. We're blessed to have you with here today. Look, as you said, a lot of people worked really hard to get you home. America never gives up. We never give in. We never leave anybody behind. We work every day, every hour. We will continue to do so to bring every American held hostage in Iran all over the world back to their families. You simply can't put America first if you don't put Americans first. Look, we have many distinguished guests in the room today. Thank you especially to the ambassadors from different countries, distinguished scholars, members of the Iranian American community who have joined us. And thank you, too, for the gracious hosting here at the National Press Club. I know many members of this club do dogged reporting to keep Americans informed on world affairs, and that a free press is a staple of a healthy democracy. More speech is important, and I can't say that I always agree with everything that's written, but what you write is read, and it matters. Get it right, get the truth, and America will prosper. I want to start with a quick story in these remarks today. Many of you here may recognize the name Abu Muhammad al-Masri, also known as Abdullah Ahmed Abdullah. He was al-Qaeda's worldwide #2 and on the FBI's most wanted list for slaughtering members of our State Department family in the Kenya and Tanzania bombings of 1998. More than 200 people, including 12 Americans, lost their lives in those attacks. The New York Times reported in November that al-Masri was shot to death on the streets of Tehran. Today, I can confirm for the first time his death on August 7th of last year. The Times wrote, quote, that he had been living in Iran was surprising, given that Iran and al-Qaeda are bitter enemies, end of quote. It could not be more wrong. It wasn't surprising at all. And more importantly, they're not enemies. Al-Masri's presence inside Iran points to the reason that we're here today. It's what I want to talk about in these remarks. Al-Qaeda has a new home base. It is the Islamic Republic of Iran. As a result, bin Laden's wicked creation is poised to gain strength and capabilities. We ignore this Iran-Al-Qaeda nexus at our own peril. We need to acknowledge it. We must confront it. Indeed, we must defeat it. Now, I know this news will come as a surprise to many Americans. We had al-Qaeda on the ropes after 9/11, thanks to sustained efforts of our brave soldiers, intelligence officers, diplomats, NATO allies, many others who worked tirelessly to defend freedom. There are far fewer al-Qaeda operatives in Afghanistan today than there have been in decades. That remains true. This is an enormous tribute to American resolve, American ingenuity, American leadership, and frankly, raw American military strength. That effort drove al-Qaeda to search for a safer haven, and they found one. The Islamic Republic of Iran was the perfect choice. Al-Qaeda has in fact carried on a relationship to Iran for nearly 3 decades, as the 9/11 Commission clearly established. In the early 90s, Al-Qaeda operatives traveled to Iran and the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon, the heartland of Hezbollah, for explosives training. In the period before 9/11, the Iranian regime told border inspectors not to stamp al-Qaeda members' passports when they entered or left Iran on their way to or from Afghanistan. This was to help them avoid suspicion when they returned to their home countries. And while there's no evidence Iran helped plan or had foreknowledge of the 9/11 attacks, at least 8 of the 9/11 hijackers traveled through Iran between October of 2000 and February of 2001. Indeed, in 2011, a federal judge in New York ruled that Iran had provided support for the 9/11 attacks based on the role it played in furthering al-Qaeda operatives' plans. And of course, after 9/11, hundreds of al-Qaeda terrorists and their families fleeing America's righteous vengeance took refuge there inside of Iran. A letter from bin Laden, found by the Navy SEALs during the Abbottabad raid, sums up the relationship since 9/11 very well. In his own words, quote, Iran is our main artery for funds, personnel, and communication. There is no need to fight with Iran unless you are forced to, end of quote. These are bin Laden's own words about his and al-Qaeda's relationship with the Islamic Republic of Iran. Of course, there's more evidence as well. In 2013, the Canadian government disrupted an al-Qaeda plot against a passenger train that linked Toronto and New York. The Canadian government stated that the plotters received, quote, direction and guidance, end of quote, from al-Qaeda members living inside of Iran. No, New York Times, not a surprise. Iran arrests students, religious minorities, and environmentalists, but not jihadist al-Qaeda killers. Yet, in spite of all the assistance the Khomeini regime provided to al-Qaeda, Tehran actually imposed tight restrictions on its operatives inside of Iran for some time. The regime very closely monitored al-Qaeda members, putting them under virtual house arrest. They were in control. Bin Laden himself considered al-Qaeda members inside the Islamic Republic to be hostages. The Iranians controlled these al-Qaeda leaders. But the U.S. government didn't believe that Iran had authorized al-Qaeda to launch a terrorist attack. But I have to say today, that is not the situation. Indeed, everything changed in 2015, the same year that the Obama administration and the E3, France, Germany, and Britain, were in the middle of finalizing the JCPOA. A sea change was happening within the Iran-al-Qaeda axis. Let me give you some information that is brand new to the public today. Iran decided to allow al-Qaeda to establish a new operational headquarters on the condition that al-Qaeda operatives abide by the regime's rules governing al-Qaeda's stay inside of the country, agency, and control. Since 2015, Iran has also given al-Qaeda leaders greater freedom of movement inside of Iran under their supervision. The Iranian Ministry of Intelligence and Security and the IRGC have provided safe havens and logistical support, things like travel documents, ID cards, passports, that enable al-Qaeda activity. As a result of this assistance, al-Qaeda has centralized its leadership inside of Tehran. Ayman al-Zawahiri's deputies are there today, and frankly, they're living a normal al-Qaeda life. Al-Qaeda terrorists like Saif al-Adil and the now dead Abu Muhammad al-Mashri have been able to place a new emphasis on global operations and plotting attacks all across the world. Tehran has allowed al-Qaeda to fundraise, to freely communicate with al-Qaeda members around the world, and to perform many other functions that were previously directed from Afghanistan or Pakistan. Al-Qaeda now has time. Because they're inside of Iran, they have access to money. They have a range of Iranian support. They now have new tools for terror. You now have the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism, the Islamic Republic of Iran, as the home base for al-Qaeda. They are partners in terrorism, partners in hate. This axis poses a grave threat to the security of nations and to the American homeland itself. I would say Iran is indeed the new Afghanistan as the key geographic hub for al-Qaeda. But it's actually worse. Unlike in Afghanistan, when al-Qaeda was hiding in the mountains, al-Qaeda today is operating underneath the hard shell of the Iranian regime's protection. America has far less visibility on al-Qaeda's capabilities and their activities than we did on their activities when they were in Tora Bora or even in the mountainous regions of Pakistan. After 9/11, America was able to unleash our firepower against al-Qaeda in Afghanistan to the point that we no longer need a large military presence in that country. Today, we must use our military force surgically against al-Qaeda operatives in Yemen when necessary. We don't have the same options today because these al-Qaeda thugs are burrowed deep inside of Iran. And if we did have that option, if we chose to do that, there's much greater risk in executing it. The Iran-al-Qaeda axis threatens the progress of the Abraham Accords as well. If al-Qaeda can use terror attacks in the region to blackmail nations from joining the war and peace with Israel, then we risk grinding generational momentum for peace in the Middle East to a halt. We risk limiting the growing number of Middle East nations who will all recognize the threat from Iran. But most importantly, every country must recognize that this unholy collusion is dramatically increasing the risk of terror attacks against their people. As Iran permits al-Qaeda to communicate freely with exponents of hatred abroad, countries like France become even more vulnerable to al-Qaeda attacks like the despicable Charlie Hebdo massacre. As Iran provides al-Qaeda with travel documents like passports, countries like Germany are ripe to be the site of the recreation of something like the Hamburg cell, so instrumental in the 9/11 attacks. As Iran permits al-Qaeda leaders to travel freely to Syria, one of the world's greatest humanitarian crises will continue to rage on. Impoverished Syrians will keep being lured into becoming jihadists. If Iran permits al-Qaeda leaders to send and receive money from al-Shabaab, Western nations risk a terror attack like pre-9/11 Afghanistan, a base from sprouting up in Somalia. We risk losing control of strategic waterways. And imagine too the destruction that al-Qaeda could carry out if the Iranian regime decided to devote sizable state funds in service of al-Qaeda's goals. Imagine the vulnerability we'd have if Iran gave al-Qaeda access to its satellite networks. This is a terror organization buried deeply inside a nation state with advanced capabilities. Look, there's ample precedent for all of this if you consider the regime's support of Hezbollah, the Houthis, Shia militias in Iraq, and Sunni terror groups like Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Imagine the threat to America. Imagine the threat to Israel, to Saudi Arabia. Imagine, too, the potential to completely upend fragile places with an established al-Qaeda presence like Libya, Yemen, and the Maghreb, or increase turmoil in places like Bangladesh where al-Qaeda cells have carried out attacks. Imagine that al-Qaeda starts carrying out attacks at Iran's behest, even if the control is not perfect. Who's to say that this isn't the next form of blackmail to pressure countries back into a nuclear deal? You don't have to be a former CIA director to see the Iran-al-Qaeda axis as a massive force for evil all across the world. But the time is now for America and all free nations to crush the Iran-al-Qaeda axis. The Trump administration has actually made progress. Let's not tolerate Iran giving al-Qaeda a second wind. Let's not downplay the danger of Sunni-Shia cooperation in terror. Let's not lie to the American people about Iranian moderation and pretend appeasement will work. 30 years of cooperation shows that Iran and al-Qaeda's divergent theology is no match for its convergent hatred. That's the reality. Here's reality two. Nations have an obligation to sanction entities designated as associated with al-Qaeda under the UN Security Council Resolution 1267. We've exercised American leadership by sanctioning the MOIS and the IRGC. We urge the United Nations and all countries to do the same. Today I'll announce the following actions. Today we'll announce sanctions on Iran-based al-Qaeda leaders Sultan Yusuf Hassan al-Arif and Mohammed Abateh. He is also known as Abdul Rahman al-Maghrebi. I'm also announcing designations of 3 leaders of al-Qaeda Kurdish battalions, an al-Qaeda-linked group that operates on the border between Iran and Iraq. And in a related action, I'm announcing a reward for up to $7 million under the State Department's Reward for Justice program for information that leads to the location or identification of al-Maghrebi. We want to bring him home to America for justice. In closing, I want to go back to 1983. It was the fall of my sophomore year at the United States Military Academy. I remember picking up the newspaper to read that a truck packed with explosives had slammed into the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut, Lebanon, killing 241 American warriors. My life wouldn't be the same after that. As a young soldier, that attack got me thinking about the big questions of national security, about America's role in the Middle East and the world. For those of you who don't remember, the terrorists who killed our fellow Americans were part of an early incarnation of Hezbollah that had the support of the Islamic Republic of Iran. I've not forgotten it, and after 4 years leading the CIA and now the State Department, I'm more clear-eyed than ever about the threat from the al-Qaeda-Iran axis. The Islamic Republic of Iran has given a new operational headquarters to the terrorist network, with more American blood on his hands than any other. People who are plotting fresh atrocities from Tehran, even as we speak. We can't ignore this truth, And just as we have done with other horrible regimes like the one in China, the Trump administrations will look to this as it is, not as we wish it to be. We see the true nature of the Iranian regime and we refuse to indulge it. We speak the truth about the nature of the Iran-Al-Qaeda relationship, and we've taken significant actions to crush it. We urge every country to do the same for the good of their own people and the good of the security, stability, and prosperity of the world. The free world's battle against terrorism will go on. May America always lead in that fight. Thank you. May God bless all of you, and may God bless the United States of America. Thank you.